I never thought a piece of paper slipped under my door at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday would be the beginning of the most satisfying legal destruction I've ever witnessed. But here we are, and by the end of this story, a man who owned 23 properties will own exactly 0. My name is Marcus, I'm 34. And I used to be a paralegal before I switched careers into software development, which is important because knowing just enough about the law to be dangerous, turns out, is exactly the amount you need to dismantle someone's entire world. Let me take you back to March of 2019. I'd been living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Oakland, California for about 8 months. The rent was $2,400 a month, which for the Bay Area was actually reasonable, or at least as reasonable as highway robbery can be. The building was old, built in the 1960s with that classic California stucco exterior that's basically held together by paint and optimism. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, Unit 2B, and despite the building's age, I actually liked it. High ceilings, hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, and a small balcony where I could sit in the evenings and watch the neighborhood come alive. My landlord's name was Rick Carmichael, but everyone called him Rick, and Rick was the kind of guy who drove a BMW 7 Series, but wouldn't replace a broken mailbox for 6 months. He was in his late 50s, always tan like he'd just gotten back from Cabo, which he probably had, and he wore expensive watches that he'd adjust conspicuously during conversations like he wanted you to notice them. His handshake was too firm, the kind that's trying to communicate dominance rather than friendliness, and he had this habit of calling everyone Chief or Buddy in a way that made your skin crawl. The first time I met Rick was during the apartment showing, before I signed the lease. He'd showed up 20 minutes late, didn't apologize, and spent the entire walkthrough taking phone calls while I looked around. When I asked about the water stains on the ceiling in the bedroom, he waved his hand dismissively and said something about old buildings having character. When I asked about the heating system, he said it worked fine and changed the subject. Red flags everywhere, but I was desperate. I'd just driven across the country with everything I owned in a U-Haul. My new job started in a week, and the Oakland housing market was absolutely brutal. Now, I need you to understand something about Rick right from the start. This wasn't just a guy who was bad at his job. This was a man who had turned being a slumlord into an art form. Within my first month, I discovered he was charging me for water and garbage separately, even though California law requires those to be included in rent for buildings constructed before 1980. I found this out because I'm the kind of person who actually reads their lease agreement, all 47 pages of it, and then cross-references it with state law. Strike one. Then I found out he was keeping everyone's security deposits in his personal checking account instead of a separate interest-bearing account. I discovered this when I overheard him on the phone in the hallway one day, talking to his accountant about moving money around. Strike two. The building had black mold in 3 units that he'd just painted over. I found this out from my neighbor, an older woman named Patricia who'd lived there for 6 years and had chronic respiratory problems that her doctor said were likely from mold exposure. Strike 3, 4, and 5. But I didn't make waves at first. I was new to the area, trying to establish myself in a new job at a tech startup in San Francisco, and I'd moved across the country from North Carolina where I'd left behind a failed engagement and a law firm that I realized was slowly crushing my soul. My ex-fiancée, Rebecca, had been a corporate lawyer, driven and ambitious in a way that I thought I admired until I realized it meant 80-hour work weeks and a relationship that existed mostly via text message. The breakup had been messy, the kind where you have to divide up not just stuff but also friends, and I decided that a fresh start on the opposite coast was exactly what I needed. I just wanted peace. I wanted to come home, cook dinner, play video games, and pretend that adult life wasn't an endless series of people trying to exploit you. I'd spend my evenings on that creaky balcony, drinking beer and teaching myself Python, trying to transition my legal research skills into something that felt less soul-crushing. My apartment became my sanctuary, the place where I could decompress from BART commutes and startup culture, and the general chaos of trying to rebuild a life from scratch. That peace lasted exactly 8 months. The notice that got slipped under my door wasn't even an official eviction notice, not that I knew that at the time. I found it when I got home from work around 7 p.m., just a piece of paper on my floor, slightly crumpled from being shoved under the door. It was a Word document, printed on regular printer paper, not even on letterhead, that said I had 30 days to vacate the premises due to owner move-in. The formatting was off, the margins were wrong, and there were 2 typos. It was signed with a digital signature that looked like it had been copied and pasted from another document. Now, in California, an owner move-in eviction is legal, but it comes with very specific rules. The landlord has to actually move in. They have to live there for at least 36 consecutive months. They have to give 60 days notice if you've lived there more than a year. And most importantly, they have to file the proper paperwork with the city. I knew all of this because during my paralegal days, I'd worked on exactly 2 landlord-tenant cases, both of which had involved eviction disputes. The knowledge was rusty, buried under years of contract law and corporate filings, but it was there. I'd lived there 8 months, so technically 30 days was correct for my situation, but something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a gut feeling, that same instinct that made me good at my paralegal job. The ability to sense when someone's lying before you even see the evidence. I read the notice 5 times, standing in my kitchen under the fluorescent light that flickered every 30 seconds. Another thing Rick had never fixed, and with each reading, more details jumped out at me. The language was too casual. The lack of official filing information. The fact that it had been slipped under my door at night instead of being properly served. So I did what any paranoid former legal professional would do. I started digging. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and a growing sense that I'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple eviction. I made coffee at midnight, then again at 3 a.m., and by the time the sun came up, I had 6 pages of notes and a very clear picture that something was seriously wrong. First, I checked the property records online through the Alameda County Assessor's website. The building was owned by an LLC called Carmichael Properties Holdings. Okay, standard practice for landlords, liability protection and all that. Nothing suspicious there. But then I looked up the LLC registration through the California Secretary of State's business search portal and found out it was registered to an address in Walnut Creek, which was about 30 miles away. Rick lived in Walnut Creek. I knew this because he'd mentioned it during the lease signing. Something about his commute and how he was doing me a favor by driving all the way to Oakland. Which raised the question, if Rick lived in Walnut Creek, in what I assumed was probably a nice house given his BMW and his expensive watches, why would he need to move into my crappy second-floor apartment in Oakland? It didn't make sense. People don't downgrade their living situations without a reason. And Rick didn't strike me as the kind of guy who'd move from a house to an apartment, as some kind of lifestyle simplification choice. I spent the entire next day at work completely useless, just refreshing public records databases and going down internet rabbit holes. My coworkers probably thought I was having some kind of breakdown, staring at my screen with this intense focus while completely ignoring the Slack messages piling up. My manager, a guy named Trevor who was 26 and had never managed anyone before, stopped by my desk around 2 p.m. to ask if everything was okay. I told him I had a personal situation I was dealing with, which was true, and he backed off, probably relieved he didn't have to actually manage anything. I found out that Carmichael Properties Holdings owned 23 properties across the East Bay. Some were single-family homes in neighborhoods like Fruitvale and San Antonio. Most were small apartment buildings like mine, scattered across Oakland, Berkeley, and one in Hayward. And here's where it got interesting. I found 6 other owner move-in evictions filed by Rick's LLC in the past 3 years. 6. I pulled the records for each one, cross-referenced the dates, mapped them out on a timeline. Unless this man was living in a different apartment every 6 months, like some kind of rental nomad, something was very wrong. The pattern was obvious once I saw it. Eviction filed, property goes vacant for a few months, property gets relisted at a significantly higher rent. Eviction filed, vacancy, higher rent, over and over. The gaps between eviction and relisting ranged from 2 months to 8 months, but they were all well short of the 36-month requirement for owner move-in. This wasn't a landlord moving into his properties. This was a landlord gaming the system to clear out tenants and jack up rents. That weekend, Saturday morning, I got up early and started what I'd started calling Operation Carmichael. I made a list of all 6 properties where Rick had filed owner move-in evictions, grabbed my camera, my notebook, and drove to each address. The first property was a small house in the Fruitvale district, painted yellow with white trim, with a chain-link fence around a tiny front yard. There was a car in the driveway, a Honda Civic with a baby seat in the back. Someone was living there. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes until I saw a woman come out with a toddler, and I worked up the nerve to approach her. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound friendly and non-threatening. I'm looking at houses in the neighborhood, thinking about moving here. How do you like it? She was suspicious at first, rightfully so. Some random guy asking questions on a Saturday morning. But I had my camera visible and a story ready about being new to the area. We talked for about 10 minutes. She'd been living there for 18 months. Before her, she said, the house had been empty for a while, and before that, she'd heard from neighbors that a family had been evicted. The rent when she moved in was $300 to $200 a month, and she mentioned that the previous tenants had been paying around $100–800, according to what the neighbors told her. I thanked her, went back to my car and felt my stomach drop. That was a 78% rent increase. I drove to the second address, an apartment building similar to mine in West Oakland. I knocked on a few doors, pretending to be interested in the neighborhood. One woman, probably in her 60s, told me she'd been evicted 2 years ago for owner move-in, and within 4 months the apartment was re-rented at almost double her rate. She'd been paying $1,400, the new tenant was paying $2,600. She was still bitter about it. You could hear it in her voice, the injustice of being forced out of a home she'd lived in for 4 years, because the landlord claimed he needed to move in, only to see someone else living there months later. The third address gave me the same story. A guy in his 30s, mechanic by the look of the oil stains on his driveway, told me he'd been evicted in 2018 using the owner move-in excuse, and when he drove by 6 months later out of curiosity, there was a new tenant's car in his old parking spot. He'd tried to fight it at the time, but he didn't have money for a lawyer, and by the time he realized what had happened, he'd already moved and didn't know what to do about it. This was an owner move-in, this was fraud. Rick was using a legal eviction loophole to clear out long-term tenants paying below market rents so he could bring in new tenants at current market rates. And in California's insane housing market, especially in the Bay Area where rents had been climbing 10 to 15% annually, he was making an absolute killing doing it. My hands were shaking when I got back in my car after the third interview. I felt my blood pressure rising in a way I hadn't felt since my law firm days. That specific anger that comes from watching someone exploit the system while people suffer for it. These weren't just statistics or case files. These were real people who'd been forced out of their homes, had to find new places in an impossible market, probably paid more in rent, definitely paid moving costs, lost their communities, disrupted their kids' schools. And Rick had done it deliberately, systematically, because he'd figured out that he could hide behind a legal eviction process, and no one would check whether he was actually following through on the owner move-in requirement. But anger without evidence is just noise. So I needed proof, real proof, the kind that would hold up not just in housing court, but potentially in criminal court, because my paralegal instincts were telling me this had crossed the line from civil violations into criminal fraud. I went home and created a spreadsheet. I know that sounds boring, but trust me, this spreadsheet was about to become Rick's worst nightmare. I set it up with multiple tabs, color coding formulas to calculate rent increases and timeline gaps. Column 1, property address. Column 2, eviction date. Column 3, reason for eviction listed in the filing. Column 4, actual outcome based on my research. Column 5, date property was re-rented. Column 6, old rental price. Column 7, new rental price. Column 8, percentage increase. Column 9, gap between eviction and re-rental. Column 10, notes and sources. I spent all of Sunday populating it with the information I'd gathered, and the pattern was damning. Average rent increase across the 6 properties, 64%. Average gap between eviction and re-rental for 3 months. Number of properties where Rick actually moved in for the required 36 months, 0. But 6 properties wasn't enough. If I was going to take this to authorities, I needed comprehensive data. So Monday morning, I called in sick to work, which I felt only slightly guilty about because this felt more important than debugging someone's React component, and I went down to the Alameda County Superior Court. I filed public records requests with Oakland's rent adjustment program and with the courts in Oakland, Berkeley, and Hayward for all eviction notices filed by Carmichael Properties Holdings over the past 10 years. The clerk in Oakland, a tired-looking woman named Denise who'd probably processed 1 million of these requests, told me it would take 2 weeks and cost me $47 in processing fees. I paid it on the spot with my credit card. I filed similar requests in Berkeley and Hayward. Then I went to the county recorder's office and requested property transfer records for all 23 properties owned by Rick's LLC. Another 35. I was hemorrhaging money on copying fees and processing charges, but I didn't care. This was an investment. While I waited for the records requests to process, I did more fieldwork. I visited all 23 properties over the course of 2 weeks, taking photos, noting which ones had tenants, which ones looked vacant, what kind of shape they were in. I started a new document where I recorded every detail. Property at 4782 Martin Luther King Jar Way, 8-unit building needs paint, 3 mailboxes broken, trash overflowing. Property at 1234 Blake Street, single-family home, well-maintained, children's toys in yard, someone definitely living there. I created fake email accounts and responded to rental listings for Rick's properties, pretending to be interested in renting. I saved every email exchange, every quoted price, every application form he sent me. I noticed that several of the application forms asked illegal questions, things like country of origin and whether I had children, both of which are prohibited under fair housing laws. More evidence for the pile. The records came back 2 weeks later, exactly when promised, and I picked them up on my lunch break, carrying 3 manila envelopes back to my apartment like they were nuclear launch codes. That night, I spread everything out on my living room floor and got to work. 14 owner move-in evictions in 4 years. 14. Not 6 like I'd initially found, but 14. Rick had been doing this even more systematically than I'd realized. I cross-referenced every single address with current tenant information using a mix of public records, Google Street View, voter registration data which is public in California, and just straight-up detective work. I spent hours on property listing websites, looking at the rental history of each address. Zillow keeps historical data on rental prices, and so does Apartments.com. I found listings from before the evictions and listings from after. The rent increases were staggering. A 2-bedroom that had been renting for wonders, $600 was listed 6 months after an owner move-in eviction for $2,800. A 3-bedroom house jumped from $2,100 to $3,900. A studio apartment went from $100 to $950. Out of those 14 evictions, Rick had actually moved into exactly 0 of the properties. Not a single one. Every single unit had been re-rented within 2 to 8 months, at an average rent increase of 64%. We're talking about apartments that were going for $1,800 suddenly being listed for $2,900. In one case, a family that had been paying $2,100 for a 3-bedroom house got evicted, and the house was back on the market 6 weeks later for $4,200. Exactly double. That felt personal, like Rick wasn't even trying to hide it. Like he knew he could get away with it, so why be subtle? Here's what made me physically sick. And I mean, I actually had to go to the bathroom and splash cold water on my face. One of those evictions was a single mother with 2 kids who'd lived in her apartment for 7 years. 7 years of on-time rent, no complaints, a model tenant. Her name was Jennifer Martinez, and Rick had evicted her in September of 2017, claiming owner move-in. By February 2018, the apartment was relisted at $2,060.50 instead of the $425 she'd been paying. I found her story in a local news article from the East Bay Express about the housing crisis. The reporter had interviewed her as an example of long-term residents being displaced. She'd ended up having to move to Sacramento, which meant her kids changed schools mid-year. She lost her job as a dental hygienist because the commute was impossible, 80 miles each way. And the last update I could find suggested she'd moved in with her parents in Stockton, after Sacramento didn't work out either. Her entire life had been uprooted because Rick wanted an extra first $200 a month in rent. That was the moment I decided this wasn't just about my eviction anymore. This was about every person Rick had screwed over in his quest to squeeze every possible dollar out of the housing crisis. I wasn't just going to fight my eviction. I was going to end him. That probably sounds dramatic, maybe even vindictive, but I didn't care. I'd spent 3 years as a paralegal watching wealthy people exploit loopholes and seeing poor people get crushed by systems they didn't understand. And I'd left that job partly because I couldn't stomach it anymore. But now I had a chance to actually do something, to use those skills for something that mattered. I started documenting everything about my own situation with obsessive detail. I took photos of the eviction notice, both sides, in good lighting. I photographed the envelope it came in, except it hadn't come in an envelope, it had been slipped under my door, which itself was probably an improper service. I started a log of every interaction with Rick. I went back through my phone and email and found every previous conversation we'd had. A text message from month 2 where I'd asked about getting the heat fixed, and he'd responded 3 days later saying he'd get to it eventually. An email from month 5 where I'd complained about the mailbox being broken, and he told me to use the package locker instead. I created a timeline of my tenancy. Move-in date, first rent payment, every maintenance request, every communication, every issue with the property. I photographed every problem in my apartment. The water stains Rick had dismissed as character. the windows that didn't seal properly and let in cold air, the bathroom tile that was cracked and had started to mold, the kitchen cabinet door that had fallen off its hinges 3 months ago and still hadn't been fixed despite 2 requests. Now, California has something called the Ellis Act and various rent control ordinances, but what Rick was doing was actually simpler and in some ways more insidious. He was violating California Civil Code Section 1946, 2, which governs owner move-in evictions. The penalties for fraudulent owner move-in evictions are severe. We're talking actual damages plus up to 3 times the damages in penalties, plus attorney's fees. Treble damages, they call it in legal terms. But more importantly, there's a section of California law that allows for pattern and practice complaints, meaning if you can prove someone is systematically violating tenant rights, the penalties multiply and the city gets involved and it can become a criminal matter. I needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. I needed someone who specialized in tenant rights and who had the resources to take on what was about to become a significant case. I wasn't naive enough to think I could do this alone. Sure, I had paralegal experience, but that's like saying you know medicine because you're a nurse. But valuable skills, but not the same as being a doctor. I needed someone who'd been to trial, who knew the judges, who had credibility with the city attorney's office. I spent 3 days cold calling law firms from a list I compiled using the state bar website, filtering for attorneys who specialized in tenant rights and landlord disputes. Most of them were interested until they heard how much work it would involve. I'd explained that I had 14 documented cases of fraud, a pattern of systematic evictions, and evidence that would require extensive investigation, and I could hear them mentally calculating the hours and the risk. Tenant rights cases are usually small dollar amounts, a few thousand here or there, not worth the effort for firms that bill by the hour. They'd politely tell me they were too busy or suggest I contact legal aid. Then I found Maria Gonzalez at Bay Area Tenant Advocates. Her website showed a picture of a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Her bio said she'd been practicing tenant law for 18 years, had won several precedent-setting cases, and specifically mentioned taking on pattern and practice complaints against landlords. I called her office on a Thursday afternoon, expecting to leave a voicemail, and was surprised when she answered herself. "Maria Gonzalez," she said, brisk and professional. "Hi, my name is Marcus Thompson, and I have a landlord-tenant case that I think you might be interested in." I gave her the elevator pitch, 30 seconds summarizing Rick's evictions, the pattern I'd found, the evidence I'd compiled. "Send me what you have," she said. "Email it to me right now while I have you on the phone." I put her on speaker, opened my laptop, and sent her my spreadsheet, my timeline, my documentation, my photos, everything I'd compiled into a 47-page PDF. I heard her computer ding with the email notification. "Give me 30 minutes to look at this," she said. "I'll call you back." She called back in 45 minutes, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. That specific tone lawyers get when they smell blood in the water. "Marcus?" she said. "Where did you get all this? This is incredibly thorough." "Are you an attorney?" "Former paralegal," I said. "I worked at a firm in North Carolina for 3 years before I switched to tech." "This makes sense now. Okay, listen. What you've documented here. This isn't just a civil case, this is potentially criminal fraud. We need to expand this investigation, and we need to do it carefully because if we're going to go after this guy, we need to bury him so deep he never resurfaces." I felt a chill run down my spine, the good kind. The kind that tells you you've found the right person. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "First, you need to hire me. My normal rate for something like this would be out of reach for most tenants. But I'm willing to take this on contingency. That means I don't get paid unless we win. And when we win, I take 40% of whatever we recover plus my fees get paid by the defendant. Are you comfortable with that?" "Absolutely," I said. "Second, I need you to not do any more investigation on your own. From this point forward, everything needs to be done through proper legal channels, because if this becomes a criminal case, we can't have any issues with evidence collection or chain of custody. No more door knocking, no more fake emails, nothing. You've done amazing work getting us this far, but now we do it by the book." "Understood," I said. "Third, I'm going to bring in 2 associates and a private investigator. The PI's name is James Chen, he's former Oakland PD. Left the force about 5 years ago, and he specializes in corporate fraud investigations. If there's more to find here, he'll find it. But his services aren't cheap, so we need to be strategic about how we use him." "Whatever it takes," I said. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday at her office in downtown Oakland. And I spent the weekend in a state of nervous energy. I couldn't focus on anything. I tried to work on my coding projects, but my mind kept drifting. I tried to watch TV, but I couldn't follow the plots. I went for runs, long ones, trying to burn off the anxiety and anticipation. This was really happening. I was really gonna take on Rick, and I'd found someone who believed the case was strong enough to bet her time and money on it. Monday came, and I showed up at Maria's office 15 minutes early. Her practice was in a converted Victorian house near Lake Merritt, the kind of place with creaky floors and high ceilings and crown molding. The reception area smelled like coffee and old books. Maria came out to greet me herself, a striking woman with graying hair pulled back in a bun, wearing a blazer and slacks that looked expensive but not showy. "Professional, Marcus," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Come on back. The team is waiting." She led me to a conference room where two younger attorneys sat with laptops open and legal pads ready. "This is Sarah Kim and David Rodriguez, my associates. They're going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this case." Sarah looked to be in her late 20s, Korean-American, with an intense focus that reminded me of myself. David was probably early 30s Latino, with an easy smile that I suspected hid a sharp legal mind. "Before we get started," Maria said, "I want you to meet James Chen. He's joining us via video call." She opened a laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was an Asian man in his 40s, sitting in what looked like a home office with shelves full of binders behind him. "Marcus," James said, "Maria's been filling me in on your case. I've got to say, the preliminary work you did is some of the best documentation I've seen from a non-professional. You've got good instincts." "Thanks," I said, feeling oddly proud of the compliment. "Here's what I'm thinking," James continued. "We need to expand beyond just the eviction pattern. If this guy is committing systematic fraud with the owner move-in scam, there's probably other violations too. I want to look at his financials, his tax returns if we can get them, his other business dealings. I want to know if he's doing this with other properties outside the East Bay. I want to know if he has partners or if this is a solo operation. And most importantly, I want to establish clear intent, that he knew what he was doing was illegal and did it anyway." Maria nodded. "James is going to start by pulling Rick's financial records, the public ones, corporate filings, LLC registrations, property transfers. We're also going to request utility records for all 23 properties, which we can get through a civil subpoena once we file the complaint. If Rick was actually moving into these apartments like he claimed, the utility bills would show occupancy patterns. I'm betting they won't." "Here's the plan," Maria said, looking at me. "We're going to file a lawsuit on your behalf first, within the next 2 weeks. That establishes you as the plaintiff and gets the ball rolling. We're suing for wrongful eviction, fraud, breach of warranty of habitability, violation of tenant rights under California law, emotional distress, and a few other causes of action. The goal with the initial complaint is to make it clear we're serious and we have evidence." "But," Sarah interjected, "the real case is going to be the pattern and practice complaint that we file simultaneously with the Oakland City Attorney's Office and potentially with the California Attorney General. That's where we lay out all 14 evictions, all the evidence of systematic fraud, and request that they open a criminal investigation." David added, "The beautiful thing about criminal prosecution is that the burden of proof shifts. In a civil case, we have to prove our case by preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. But once there's a criminal case, the prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a higher standard, but they also have more resources and more tools. They can compel testimony, offer immunity deals, use grand juries. If the AG decides to take this on, it's game over for your landlord." I sat there absorbing all of this, feeling like I'd accidentally stumbled into something much bigger than I'd initially realized. "So what do you need from me?" I asked. "Right now, nothing," Maria said. "You've done the hard part. You found the evidence, you documented everything, you brought it to us. Now you sit back and let us do our jobs. You go to work, you live your life, you don't talk to Rick about any of this. If he contacts you, you refer him to me. If he tries to serve you with more eviction paperwork, you call me immediately. Otherwise you wait." "One more thing," James said from the laptop screen. "I need you to sign some authorizations so I can access your rental records, utility bills, any communications with the landlord. And I need you to write down everything you remember about your interactions with Rick. Every conversation, every text message, every phone call, everything. Details matter. If he said something that indicated he knew what he was doing was wrong, I need to know about it." "I can do that," I said. The meeting lasted another hour, going through details, signing paperwork, authorizations for Maria to represent me, contingency fee agreements, conflict of interest disclosures. By the time I left, it was dark outside, and I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. This was really happening. Maria kept her word about the 2-week timeline. Her office worked fast, and on a Friday morning, exactly 13 days after our first meeting, she called to tell me the complaint had been filed. "It's done," she said. "We filed this morning in Alameda County Superior Court. Rick will be served by Monday at the latest. And I sent our pattern and practice complaint to the Oakland City Attorney's Office an hour ago." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we wait for Rick to respond. He has 30 days to file an answer to the complaint. In the meantime, James is going to continue his investigation, and I'm going to start scheduling depositions. We're going for everyone: Rick, his property managers, his accountants, anyone who touches his rental business." That weekend was surreal. I kept checking the court website to see the case filing, reading and rereading the complaint. Maria had laid it out beautifully: 8 causes of action, 47 pages of detailed allegations, and an exhibit list that included my spreadsheet, photos of all 14 properties, copies of the fraudulent eviction notices, and rental price comparisons. She was asking for actual damages, punitive damages, treble damages under California tenant protection laws, and attorney's fees. The prayer for relief, that's the legal term for what you're asking the court to award you, was $385,000 plus fees and costs. But the really damaging part was the pattern and practice complaint to the city. Maria had sent me a copy, and it was devastating. She'd laid out the entire scheme, named all 14 tenants who'd been fraudulently evicted, calculated the total amount Rick had gained from the illegal rent increases, which came to over $800,000 based on the difference between old and new rents multiplied by the time periods. She'd included citations to California law, references to similar cases where landlords had been criminally prosecuted, and a detailed explanation of why this rose to the level of criminal fraud rather than just civil violations. Rick was served on Monday morning at his home in Walnut Creek, according to the process server's declaration that got filed with the court. I imagined him answering his door, probably annoyed at being bothered, taking the papers from the process server, closing the door and reading the complaint. I wondered what his face looked like when he realized what was happening. When he saw 14 documented evictions laid out with evidence. When he saw that I wasn't just rolling over like his other tenants had. His response was to dig in and fight. He hired a big law firm from San Francisco, Morrison, Levitt and Associates, the kind of place with mahogany conference rooms and lawyers who bill $800 an hour. I looked them up. They occupied 3 floors of a high-rise downtown, had 140 attorneys, and specialized in real estate litigation. This was going to be expensive for Rick, which gave me a certain satisfaction. His strategy became clear quickly. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that my complaint failed to state a claim, that owner move-in evictions were legal and I hadn't proven fraud, that I was just a disgruntled tenant making wild accusations. They filed a motion to strike the punitive damages, arguing there was no evidence of malice or oppression. They filed a motion for a protective order trying to limit discovery. It was a scorched earth defense. Throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. Try to drown the other side in paperwork and motion practice. But he made one critical mistake. He didn't realize that Maria's firm had been waiting for a case like this for years, and they had funding from a tenant rights nonprofit that specifically wanted to pursue test cases against landlord fraud. Money wasn't going to be the issue that made us back down. The motion to dismiss got denied. Judge Patricia Morrison, who'd been assigned to our case, read the complaint, read the motion, and issued a ruling that was basically a judicial eye roll. She wrote that the complaint adequately alleged fraud with sufficient specificity. That pattern and practice complaints were exactly the kind of systemic violation claims that warranted discovery, and that dismissal at this early stage would be inappropriate. Motion denied. The motion to strike punitive damages also got denied. Judge Morrison noted that allegations of systematic fraud over multiple years with multiple victims could support punitive damages if proven at trial. Motion denied. The motion for protective order limiting discovery got partially granted but mostly denied. Rick's lawyers wanted to limit us to deposing only Rick himself, and to prevent us from accessing his financial records. Judge Morrison said no to the financial records limitation, noting that fraud claims inherently require examination of financial motive and gain, but she did limit us to 8 depositions total, which was still plenty for our purposes. 3 motions, 3 losses for Rick, and each motion had probably cost him 20,000 to 30,000 in legal fees. He was hemorrhaging money and getting nothing for it. Discovery was brutal for Rick. We requested every document related to every eviction Rick had filed in the past 10 years. We requested all corporate records for Carmichael Properties Holdings. We requested tax returns, bank statements, property management agreements, rental applications, lease agreements, rent payment records, security deposit records, maintenance records. We requested all communications with tenants, all communications with his property managers, all communications with his attorneys. We requested utility bills for all 23 properties going back 5 years. Rick's lawyers tried to object to most of it, claiming it was overly broad or unduly burdensome or not reasonably calculated to lead to admissible evidence. Judge Morrison held a discovery hearing and basically told Rick's lawyers to stop wasting everyone's time and turn over the documents. She gave them 60 days to produce everything. While we waited for document production, James Chen was doing his own investigation, and what he found was incredible. He started by pulling Rick's publicly available financial records, corporate filings, LLC registrations, property transfers. Then he did something brilliant. He requested the utility records for all 23 properties directly from PG&E Pacific Gas and Electric, using a civil subpoena. See, if Rick was actually moving into these apartments like he claimed in his owner move-in evictions, the utility bills would show occupancy patterns. Normal usage. Electricity for lights and appliances, gas for heating and cooking, water for showers and dishes. But they didn't. Every single property that Rick claimed to have moved into showed utility usage consistent with vacancy or minimal use, usually just enough to run a refrigerator and maybe some lights on a timer to make it look occupied. James plotted it all out on graphs, comparing the utility usage before the eviction when the tenant lived there, during the supposed owner occupancy period, and after when the new tenant moved in. The pattern was identical across all 14 properties. Normal usage, then a dramatic drop to almost nothing for a few months, then back to normal usage. In one particularly damning example, the water usage during Rick's supposed occupancy period was literally 0 for 3 consecutive months. Unless Rick was some kind of vampire who didn't need water, he wasn't living there. But James didn't stop there. He started interviewing other tenants in Rick's buildings, people who were still living there, and he built relationships with them. Tenants talk to each other, they know what's going on in their buildings, and James had a gift for getting people to open up. He found multiple tenants who'd been harassed, threatened with eviction for minor lease violations, or pressured to move out so Rick could raise the rent. He found tenants living in units with serious habitability issues, black mold, leaking roofs, broken heating systems, that Rick refused to fix. Then James found Sandra Chen, no relation despite the same last name, a former property manager who Rick had fired 3 years earlier. Sandra was furious when James tracked her down and explained what we were investigating. Rick had fired her because she'd refused to process what she knew were fraudulent evictions, and she'd kept copies of everything. Emails, text messages, recorded phone conversations. California is a 2-party consent state for recording, but Sandra had been smart enough to get Rick's consent on tape at the beginning of their conversations. "I need to record this call for my records," she'd say at the start of phone calls, and Rick would say, "Yeah, fine, whatever." And that was legal consent. She'd been doing it for months before Rick fired her, just protecting herself, and now those recordings were about to become evidence. In one email that Sandra forwarded to James, Rick explicitly told her to file an owner move-in eviction for a tenant who'd complained to the city about habitability issues, and to make sure we get someone in there who'll pay market rate and keep their mouth shut. The email was dated April 2017, and it was smoking gun evidence of intent. Rick knew what he was doing was retaliation, knew it was wrong, and did it anyway. In a text message, Rick had joked about his owner move-in retirement plan, describing how he was using the evictions to systematically upgrade his tenant base to people who could afford higher rents. He'd literally written, "Why should I rent to someone paying $4,500 when I can get $2,800 from someone else? Just gotta move them out first. Lol." He'd actually written lol about displacing families from their homes. In a recorded phone call from August 2017, Rick told Sandra to prepare an owner move-in eviction for a single mother, Jennifer Martinez, the same woman from the news article, because she's been here too long at below market rent and I need to upgrade that unit. Sandra had pushed back, saying the eviction seemed improper, and Rick had said, and I'm quoting directly from the transcript James prepared, "Look, I'm not actually going to move in there, obviously. But the city doesn't check. They don't have the resources to verify every owner move in. We wait a few months, re-rent it, done. I've done this a dozen times and never had a problem. A dozen times. He'd admitted to doing it a dozen times. On a recorded phone call, this was a slam dunk. We had motive, we had pattern, we had documentary evidence, we had witnesses, and we had Rick's own words admitting to the fraud. Maria sent a supplemental brief to the Oakland City Attorney's office with all the new evidence James had uncovered, and she sent a copy to the California Attorney General's office as well. The Oakland City Attorney called her 3 days later. They wanted to meet. Maria, Sarah, David. James and I all drove to downtown Oakland to the city attorney's office for the meeting. We met with 2 deputy city attorneys, a woman named Angela Reeves who headed their housing enforcement division, and a man named Michael Torres who specialized in criminal prosecutions. This is the most thoroughly documented case of landlord fraud I've seen in 15 years of doing this work, Angela said after we'd presented everything. We're absolutely going to pursue this. We're going to file a civil action for penalties under Oakland's Tenant Protection Ordinance, and we're referring this to the Alameda County District Attorney for criminal prosecution. Michael added, the recorded admission alone is enough to charge him with multiple counts of fraud. Combined with everything else, this is an easy prosecution. We'll coordinate with the DA's office to make sure the civil and criminal cases support each other. I felt like I couldn't breathe. This had escalated so far beyond what I'd imagined when I started digging into Rick's evictions. We were talking about criminal charges now, not just a lawsuit, actual criminal prosecution. What kind of charges are we looking at? Maria asked. Grand theft, multiple counts, fraud, multiple counts, and possibly conspiracy if we can show he was working with others, Michael said. In California, defrauding someone of more than $950 is grand theft, and based on the documentation your investigator compiled, Rick defrauded his tenants of hundreds of thousands of dollars in aggregate. Each fraudulent eviction that resulted in financial loss to the tenant is a separate count. Timeline, Maria asked. We'll need to present to the DA, they'll review, probably take it to a grand jury for indictment. I'd say 4 to 6 months before charges are filed, assuming the DA agrees to prosecute, which I think they will given the evidence. That meeting was in October of 2019, 7 months after I'd gotten that piece of paper slipped under my door. 7 months from casual eviction notice to potential criminal indictment. Rick's life was about to implode, and he didn't even know it yet. Meanwhile, the document production deadline in our civil case came and went, and Rick's lawyers asked for an extension. Judge Morrison granted it, but grudgingly giving them 2 more weeks. When the documents finally came, they were a mess. Over 40,000 pages, poorly organized, clearly dumped with minimal effort to make them useful. It's a common tactic in litigation. Bury the other side in paper and make them work for every piece of relevant evidence. But Maria's team was prepared. Sarah and David spent 2 weeks going through everything, cataloging documents, creating an index, pulling out the most damaging evidence. They found lease agreements that showed Rick's standard practice was to keep rents low for the first year to attract tenants, then hit them with massive increases in year 2. They found emails where Rick discussed his strategy of targeting long-term tenants who were paying below market rents. They found bank records showing the deposits from the higher rents after evictions, and they found something we hadn't expected. Rick had been skimming security deposits. California law requires landlords to return security deposits within 21 days of a tenant moving out, along with an itemized statement of any deductions. Rick had been keeping deposits for 60, 90, sometimes 120 days, using them as short-term interest-free loans. The bank records showed deposits going in from tenants, then being used for Rick's personal expenses, then being returned months later. In some cases, he'd never returned them at all. Just kept them and ignored the tenants' requests. This was a separate violation, and it opened up additional causes of action. Maria filed an amended complaint adding claims for security deposit violations, bad faith, and violation of California's consumer protection laws. The prayer for relief went up to $520,000 plus fees. Deposition started in December. We deposed Rick first, and it was glorious. Maria had him on the stand, well, in a conference room at his lawyer's office technically, but on the record with a court reporter transcribing everything. For 3 days spread across 2 weeks, she walked him through every single eviction, making him explain each one. Mr. Carmichael, you filed an owner move-in eviction for the property at 4782 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Unit 3A in June of 2017, is that correct? Yes. And you claimed in the eviction notice that you were moving into that unit, correct? That was the reason stated. Yes. Did you in fact move into Unit 3A? I don't recall the specific property. Let me refresh your recollection. This is the two-bedroom apartment in West Oakland. Your LLC has owned it since 2015. Does that help? I own a lot of properties. I understand. Did you move into this property after evicting the tenant? I may have used it temporarily. What does used it temporarily mean? I may have stayed there occasionally. How many nights did you stay there? I don't remember. More than 30 nights. I don't know. Mr. Carmichael, California law requires you to occupy the property for 36 consecutive months after an owner move-in eviction. Did you live in Unit 3A for 36 consecutive months? No. Did you live there for even 1 month? Rick's lawyer objected at this point, but Rick answered anyway. No. So you filed an owner move-in eviction claiming you were going to live in the property, and you never actually lived there. It was more complicated than that. Please explain the complication. I had intended to move in, but my circumstances changed. What circumstances changed? Personal circumstances. Can you be more specific? I'd rather not discuss my personal life, Mr. Carmichael. You're claiming your personal circumstances changed such that you couldn't move into this property. I'm entitled to know what those circumstances were. Another objection from Rick's lawyer, but Judge Morrison had already ruled in a pre-deposition motion that Rick had to answer questions about his living situation. Rick eventually admitted he'd never had any intention of moving in, that the circumstances hadn't changed, that it was just a way to remove a tenant. We went through all 14 evictions like this. By the end, Rick had admitted on the record that he'd never actually lived in any of the properties, that the owner move-in evictions were just a method to clear out tenants so he could raise rents. His lawyers looked like they wanted to die. You never let your client admit to fraud in a deposition, but Rick was arrogant enough to think he could explain his way out of it, and instead he'd confessed to everything. We deposed his property managers next. 2 of them still worked for him and gave very careful, lawyered-up answers that didn't help anyone. But then we deposed Sandra Chen, and she was a dream witness. She brought all her documentation, walked us through everything, explained how Rick's operation worked. She'd essentially been the administrator of his fraud scheme, processing the evictions, preparing the paperwork, dealing with tenants, until her conscience wouldn't let her do it anymore. He was destroying people's lives, she said at one point during her deposition, and she started crying. I watched families get evicted, good people who'd never missed a rent payment, who kept their places clean, who were just trying to live their lives. And Rick didn't care. He'd joke about it. He'd say they should have been paying market rent if they wanted to stay. We deposed Rick's accountant, who testified that he'd advised Rick multiple times that the owner move-in evictions might be illegal if Rick wasn't actually moving in, and Rick had told him not to worry about it. More evidence of knowledge and intent. By March of 2020, we had over 2,000 pages of deposition transcripts, 40,000 pages of documents, recorded conversations, utility records, witness statements, and Rick's own admissions. Maria compiled it all into a trial brief and filed it with the court. We were ready for trial if it came to that, but Maria predicted Rick would want to settle once he saw how bad the evidence was. She was wrong. Rick didn't want to settle. His ego wouldn't let him admit he'd done anything wrong. His lawyers probably advised him to settle, but he refused. So we scheduled a trial date for September 2020, then COVID hit and everything shut down. Courts closed, trials got postponed, and our case went into limbo. It was frustrating. We had all this momentum, and suddenly everything just stopped. But the delay worked in our favor in an unexpected way. The California Attorney General's office, which had been reviewing our case file for months, decided to move forward with criminal charges despite the pandemic. In June of 2020, the AG's office filed charges in Sacramento County Superior Court, not against the LLC, against Rick personally. 3 counts of grand theft, 14 counts of fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud, and 5 counts of perjury for lying in the eviction paperwork where he'd claimed under penalty of perjury that he intended to occupy the properties. I'll never forget the day Maria called to tell me about the criminal charges. I was at home, because everyone was at home in June 2020, working remotely, and my phone rang in the middle of a Zoom meeting. I saw it was Maria and stepped away from my computer. "Marcus," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Sit down." "I'm already sitting," I said. "We're all sitting all the time now. The AG's office just filed criminal charges against Rick. He's being arraigned next week in Sacramento." I actually had to put my head between my knees because I felt lightheaded. The room started spinning. This had gone from a housing dispute to a civil lawsuit to a criminal prosecution. Rick wasn't just going to lose money, he was potentially going to prison. Marcus. You still there? Yeah, I managed. I'm here, I can't believe this is happening. Believe it. 23 counts total. If he's convicted on everything, he's looking at 15 to 20 years. Now, he probably won't get the maximum and there'll be a plea deal offered, but this is serious. This is felony prosecution. The arraignment was scheduled for the following week, done remotely because of COVID. I was allowed to watch via the court's public video link. Rick appeared from what looked like his lawyer's office, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car, looking tan and confident despite everything. His criminal defense attorney was even more expensive than his civil attorneys, a guy named Theodore Blackwell who specialized in white-collar crime and apparently charged Wallows $200 an hour. The judge read the charges, all 23 of them, and Rick's face changed as the list went on and on. Grand theft, fraud, conspiracy, perjury. It took almost 10 minutes to read all the charges. Rick entered a not guilty plea, which was expected, and bail was set at $500,000. His lawyer argued for lower bail, saying Rick was a respected businessman with ties to the community, and the prosecutor argued for higher bail, saying Rick had committed systematic fraud affecting dozens of victims over many years. The judge went with $500,000, and Rick made bail that same day. The criminal case started moving forward, slower than I would have liked because of COVID delays, but moving. The prosecution offered Rick a plea deal in August 2020. Plead guilty to 5 felony fraud charges, serve 18 months in county jail, pay $600,000 in restitution, and permanently forfeit his right to own rental properties in California. Also cooperate fully with the civil cases against him, which would include admitting to the fraud and turning over all remaining documents. Rick turned it down. His lawyer must have convinced him they could win at trial, or at least that he could get a better deal. It was a massive mistake. The civil case resumed in October 2020 with remote proceedings. Judge Morrison scheduled a settlement conference and strongly encouraged both sides to resolve the case before trial. Maria went into the conference asking for $750,000. Her number had gone up because we'd added more claims and because Rick's obstruction had increased our legal fees. Rick's lawyers offered $50,000 and dismissal of my eviction. Maria laughed at them, literally laughed, and the settlement conference ended with no agreement. Trial was rescheduled for February 2021 because of ongoing COVID delays, then rescheduled again to May 2021. The criminal trial was scheduled for June 2021. Rick's lawyers tried to get the civil trial delayed until after the criminal trial, arguing that Rick would have to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination in the civil trial, which would prejudice him. Judge Morrison denied the motion, saying Rick had created this situation himself and the civil case had been filed first. The civil trial started on May 3, 2021, conducted in person with masks and social distancing. I attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching Maria dismantle Rick piece by piece. She started with my testimony, walking me through my tenancy, the eviction notice, my investigation. Then she called Sandra Chen, who testified about Rick's instructions to file fraudulent evictions and his admissions that he never intended to occupy the properties. Then Maria called 8 other former tenants who'd been fraudulently evicted, each one telling their story. The single mother who'd moved to Sacramento, the elderly couple, the veteran, a school teacher who'd been forced to move mid-semester and lost her job, a family with a special needs child who'd been in a good school district and had to transfer to a school without the right resources. Story after story of lives disrupted. Financial harm, emotional distress. Maria introduced the utility records showing 0 occupancy during the supposed owner move-in periods. She introduced Rick's tax returns showing he'd claimed his Walnut Creek house as his primary residence every single year, which contradicted his claims that he'd moved into the Oakland properties. She introduced the bank records showing the higher rent deposits after evictions. She played the recorded phone calls where Rick admitted the evictions were fake. Rick's lawyers tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that Rick had intended to move in but circumstances changed, that the utility records were inconclusive, that the rent increases were just market adjustments. But they had no explanation for the recorded conversations, no explanation for why this happened 14 times, no explanation for the tax returns. Rick took the stand in his own defense, which was a terrible decision. Maria cross-examined him for 6 hours across 2 days, and it was brutal. She got him to admit again that he'd never lived in any of the properties. She got him to admit that he knew California law required 36 months of occupancy. She got him to admit that he'd raised the rent substantially after each eviction. Every time his lawyer tried to rehabilitate his testimony on redirect examination, Maria would get up on recross and destroy whatever credibility he'd tried to rebuild. The jury was out for 2 days, which felt like forever. When they came back, they found in my favor on every single count: wrongful eviction, fraud, breach of warranty of habitability, security deposit violations, bad faith, violation of consumer protection laws, everything. They awarded me $45,000 in actual damages, $200,000 in punitive damages, and Judge Morrison added another $180,000 in attorney's fees for Maria's firm. Total judgment $425,000. But it didn't stop there. The Oakland City Attorney's case went to trial in late May, and they got a consent judgment against Rick for $2.3 million in penalties under Oakland's Tenant Protection Ordinance, plus a permanent injunction prohibiting him from filing any more owner move-in evictions in Oakland without posting a bond and proving actual occupancy. Then came the criminal trial. It started on June 14, 2021 and lasted 3 weeks. I attended every single day, taking vacation time from work, sitting in the gallery watching justice unfold. The prosecution had an easy case. They had all the same evidence we'd used in the civil trial, plus they had additional evidence from their own investigation, including interviews with more tenants, more financial records showing Rick had made over $800,000 from the fraudulent evictions over 4 years, and testimony from a real estate expert about how owner move-in evictions are supposed to work. The prosecution brought in 12 different people who Rick had defrauded. Each one testified about their eviction, their struggle to find new housing in an impossible market, their financial losses. There was Jennifer Martinez, the single mother, crying on the stand as she described having to pull her kids out of school. There was the elderly couple, Margaret and Robert Chen, who'd lost their apartment of 15 years and ended up living in their car for 2 months before they found a new place. There was Daniel Torres, the veteran with PTSD, who'd been illegally evicted and lost his service dog because he couldn't find pet-friendly housing fast enough and had to temporarily move into a shelter that didn't allow animals. And Rick just sat there, stone-faced, while his lawyer tried to argue that these were all legitimate business decisions and unfortunate misunderstandings. Theodore Blackwell did his best, suggesting that Rick had legitimately intended to move into each property, but circumstances kept changing. That the utility records didn't prove anything, because maybe Rick was just frugal with utilities, that the rent increases were just market adjustments. The jury didn't buy any of it. The recorded phone calls were played in court, Rick's voice admitting that he never intended to move in, that the city doesn't check, that he'd done this a dozen times. You could see the jury reacting, a couple of them shaking their heads, one woman looking disgusted. When the recording of Rick joking about his owner move-in retirement plan played, 2 jurors actually turned to look at Rick with expressions of disbelief. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. The prosecutor, a deputy AG named Catherine Walsh, stood in front of the jury and said, Rick Carmichael looked at vulnerable people, families paying rent on time, people who'd never caused problems, and he saw dollar signs. He saw that they were paying below market rent, and he decided to evict them using a legal process that was meant to protect property owners. But he twisted it into a tool of exploitation. He did this not once, not twice, but 14 times that we can prove, and probably more that we'll never know about. He made almost $1 million doing this while families ended up homeless, while kids had to change schools, while an elderly couple lived in their car. Catherine pointed at Rick. He knew it was wrong. We have his own voice on tape saying he knew the city wouldn't check, that he'd done it many times before. This isn't a mistake. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is calculated systematic fraud. And he needs to be held accountable. The jury was out for 4 hours. 4 hours for a 3-week trial is basically nothing. It means the verdict was obvious. They came back with guilty verdicts on every single count. All 3 grand theft charges, all 14 fraud charges, the conspiracy charge, and all 5 perjury charges. 23 for 23. I watched Rick's face when the verdict was read. He went pale. Actually pale, like all the blood had drained from his face. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder. His wife, who'd been attending the trial, started crying. I felt nothing but satisfaction. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, and in the meantime, the dominoes started falling. The civil judgments against Rick were now final. The appeals period had passed, or he'd chosen not to appeal, probably because his lawyers told him it would be pointless. He owed me $425,000, he owed the city of Oakland $2-3 million, and he still had the restitution from the criminal case coming. But the real destruction came from the banks. Rick had mortgages on all 23 properties, and most of those mortgages had clauses that said if the owner was convicted of fraud related to the properties, the loans could be called immediately, meaning the bank could demand full payment right now. 3 different banks called their loans within 2 weeks of the guilty verdict. Rick didn't have $8 million in cash lying around to pay off the mortgages. Nobody does, so the banks started foreclosure proceedings. Rick tried to stop it, filed for bankruptcy protection, but the criminal restitution and the civil judgments weren't dischargeable in bankruptcy. The foreclosures moved forward. His criminal sentencing was on August 12, 2021, and I was there in the front row. Judge Morrison asked Rick if he had anything to say before sentencing. He stood up, and I have to give him credit for audacity. He gave this bizarre speech about how he was a job creator and a small business owner, and how the system was biased against landlords, how tenants had too many protections and landlords couldn't make a living, how he was just trying to provide housing in an expensive market. He said he was sorry if anyone was hurt but that he'd never intended to cause harm. He was just running a business. Judge Morrison let him finish, and then she absolutely destroyed him. She said she'd been a judge for 23 years and had never seen such a systematic, callous, and deliberate exploitation of vulnerable people. She said Rick had taken a housing crisis and turned it into his personal profit center, that he'd looked at families struggling to afford rent and seen opportunities to extract more money. She said his complete lack of remorse, demonstrated by his statement just now trying to justify his actions, showed that he was exactly the kind of defendant who needed the maximum sentence to understand the severity of what he'd done. She sentenced him to 6 years in state prison, more than the 4-year maximum I'd expected, because she stacked some of the sentences consecutively rather than concurrently. She ordered him to pay $1.8 million in restitution to his victims, divided proportionally based on the harm each person suffered. She ordered him to pay the fines and penalties from the civil judgments, and she ordered that as a condition of any future parole, Rick could never own rental property in California again. Rick's lawyer immediately filed an appeal, but in California, you have to serve your sentence while your appeal is pending unless you can post bail, and Rick's bail pending appeal was set at $2 million, which he couldn't make because all his assets were being seized or foreclosed on. He was remanded into custody that day, led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and transported to county jail to await transfer to state prison. The foreclosures moved forward through late 2021 and into 2022. All 23 properties were sold at auction. Some were bought by non-profit housing organizations that converted them into affordable housing. Some were bought by smaller landlords who, presumably having seen what happened to Rick, were going to be a lot more careful about following the law. Some were bought by tenant cooperatives, groups of tenants who pooled their money and bought the buildings they'd been living in. Rick's BMW 7 Series got repossessed. His house in Walnut Creek went into foreclosure and sold for $4 million, with the proceeds going to pay his creditors, which included me, the city of Oakland, and his various victims. His wife Patricia divorced him while he was in prison. She filed in early 2022, claiming she hadn't known what he was doing, which I found hard to believe given that she'd been living off the profits, but she managed to keep about $200,000 in assets that hadn't been seized, her own retirement account and a settlement from the divorce. But here's my absolute favorite part of this entire story, and this is the detail that makes me smile every single time I think about it. Remember Sandra Chen, the property manager Rick fired for refusing to process fraudulent evictions? The one who kept all the evidence that helped us build the case. After everything went down, after the foreclosures and the auctions, Sandra bought one of Rick's apartment buildings, a nonprofit tenant advocacy group called East Bay Housing Justice, which had been following the case closely, helped her get financing. They have a program that helps former property managers who've been retaliated against buy and operate buildings as affordable housing. Sandra bought the 12-unit building on Martin Luther King Jr. Way, one of the first buildings where Rick had pulled his owner move-in fraud scheme, and she now runs it as an affordable housing cooperative where the tenants have a say in management decisions and rents are kept at affordable levels through subsidy programs. I drove by there in the fall of 2022, about a year after Rick went to prison, just to see it. There was a community garden in the front yard, where Rick used to have a sign threatening to tow any unauthorized vehicles. The building had been painted, bright colors, murals on one wall showing the Oakland skyline. Kids were playing on the sidewalk. Sandra saw me taking pictures and came out to say hello. Marcus. she said, giving me a hug. I was hoping you'd come by sometime. This place looks amazing, I said. Nothing like when Rick owned it. This is what he could have done, she said, gesturing at the building, at the garden, at a couple of residents sitting on the porch talking. He could have been a good landlord, made a decent profit, and actually helped people. But he got greedy and now look where he is. And look where we are. How are the tenants? I asked. Happy stable. We have a waiting list of 40 people who want to move in. Rents are set at 30% below market, and we have support services, help with job placement, childcare resources, legal aid for immigration issues. We're building community, not just collecting rent checks. I felt emotional standing there. This was what justice looked like. Not just Rick losing everything, but something better being built in its place. Thank you, I said. For keeping all that evidence, for testifying, for doing this. Thank you for starting it, she said. I'd been sitting on all that evidence for 2 years, not knowing what to do with it, feeling guilty that I wasn't doing more. And then you came along and gave me a chance to make it right. Rick served 4.5 years of his 6-year sentence before getting parole in January of 2026. Yes, just a few weeks ago. I found out because Maria called me to let me know. He's now living with his elderly mother in Modesto, a city about 90 miles inland from the Bay Area. According to the conditions of his parole, he had to find employment within 60 days of release. And he's working at a FedEx warehouse for $19 an hour, loading trucks on the overnight shift. He's not allowed to own rental property in California ever. His real estate license was permanently revoked. His corporate lawyer license, because yes, Rick was also a licensed attorney, which I hadn't known until the trial, was permanently disbarred by the state bar. He can never practice law. He can never hold a real estate license. He'll be making restitution payments to his victims until he's 67 years old, paying $2,000 a month out of his warehouse wages. The ripple effects of the case went beyond just Rick. Oakland passed stronger tenant protection laws in 2022 based on what happened, including a requirement that landlords who file owner-move-in evictions have to prove occupancy with utility bills and other documentation at 6-month intervals for the full 36 months. The California legislature introduced a bill in 2023 requiring landlords statewide to post a bond of $15,000 before filing an owner-move-in eviction. Money that goes to the tenant if the landlord doesn't actually move in. It passed and became law in 2024. Maria's law firm, Bay Area Tenant Advocates, used our case as a model to file similar pattern and practice complaints against 3 other landlords engaging in the same kind of fraud. One case settled for $3.8 million in 2023. Another went to trial and resulted in criminal convictions. The third is still pending, but the landlord is desperately trying to settle. Maria told me she gets calls every week from tenants who suspect their landlords are pulling similar schemes, and she now has 6 attorneys working full-time on tenant fraud cases. The case got written up in law journals, used as a teaching example in law schools, cited in other tenant rights cases across California and in other states. Carmichael v. Thompson, my case is now precedent. Lawyers cite it in briefs. Judges reference it in opinions. Rick's name is permanently attached to a cautionary tale about landlord fraud. As for me, I'm still in Oakland, though I moved to a different apartment about 6 months after the civil trial ended. The eviction had been invalidated by the court, so legally I could have stayed in my old place, but I didn't want to. Too many bad memories, too much stress associated with that apartment. I found a better place, ironically owned by a small nonprofit that uses a cooperative model similar to what Sandra's doing. My rent is reasonable, my landlord actually fixes things when they break, and I haven't had to think about eviction notices in years. I kept the $425,000 settlement in a high-yield savings account for a while, watching it grow, trying to decide what to do with it. Eventually I used a $120,000 as a down payment on a small condo in the Temescal neighborhood. It's mine, nobody can evict me. And every month when I make my mortgage payment, I think about Rick making his restitution payments from his FedEx warehouse wages, and I smile. People ask me sometimes if I regret the amount of time and energy I put into this case, if it was worth the stress and the 1.5 years of my life consumed by legal proceedings, the hundreds of hours of research and documentation, the emotional toll of reliving everything through testimony and depositions. And my answer is always the same. Absolutely. Because it wasn't just about me. It was never just about me. It was about Jennifer Martinez and her kids who had to move to Sacramento. It was about Margaret and Robert Chen who lived in their car. It was about Daniel Torres who lost his service dog. It was about the 14 documented victims and probably dozens more who we never found. It was about every tenant in the Bay Area who's facing an eviction and wondering if it's legal, if they should fight back, if anyone will care. The system is supposed to protect people from predators like Rick, but sometimes the system only works if someone is willing to feed it the evidence it needs, do the research, ask the questions, refuse to back down. I had the skills from my paralegal days and the stubbornness from my failed engagement and the anger from watching the housing crisis destroy people's lives. And because I had all of that, I was able to do something about it. I hope this story finds its way to people who are dealing with bad landlords, who are facing evictions that feel wrong, who are being exploited and don't know what to do about it. Here's what I learned: document everything. Save every email, every text message, every piece of paper. Take photos, take videos, keep a journal. Your memory fades, but documentation lasts forever. Learn your rights. Every state has tenant protection laws, every city has resources. Google tenant rights. Call legal aid, find a tenant union. Knowledge is power, and landlords count on you not knowing the law. Find help. You don't have to do this alone. There are lawyers who take tenant cases on contingency, who want to fight these battles. There are legal aid organizations, tenant advocacy groups, nonprofits that exist specifically to help people like you. Reach out. Ask for help. Don't assume you can't afford a lawyer. Ask about contingency fees and free consultations. And most importantly, don't assume that because someone is wealthy or powerful or has fancy lawyers that they're untouchable. Rick thought he was untouchable. He thought his LC structure and his expensive attorneys made him bulletproof. He thought tenants were just obstacles to profit, people who'd roll over and accept whatever he did because fighting back was too hard. And maybe 13 of his victims did roll over because they didn't have the time or the knowledge or the resources to fight. But I did, and because I fought back, his entire empire collapsed like a house of cards. The legal system can work sometimes if you feed it what it needs. It's not perfect, it's slow and expensive and complicated, but it can deliver justice if you're willing to work for it. I put in hundreds of hours of research, spent months of my life focused on this case, dealt with stress and anxiety and sleepless nights, and in the end I won. Rick lost everything: his properties, his money, his freedom, his future. And something better was built in the place where his empire used to be. 3 years after that paper got slipped under my door, I'm sitting in my own condo that I bought with settlement money, and I'm typing this out because I want people to know that it's possible. It's possible to fight back against corrupt landlords. It's possible to win. It's possible to get justice even when the system seems designed to protect the wealthy and punish the poor. It's hard and it takes time, and it requires documentation and persistence and help from good lawyers, but it's possible. Rick Carmichael lost 23 properties, his freedom, his marriage, his career, and his future because he got greedy and because one tenant decided to fight back. That's the lesson here. That exploitation doesn't have to be accepted as the cost of living in an expensive city. That justice is possible if you're willing to work for it. That one person with evidence and determination can bring down an entire empire built on fraud. And to Rick, if you're somehow reading this during your break at the FedEx warehouse in Modesto, I want you to know something. I don't hate you. I don't think about you much at all anymore. Honestly, you're not worth the mental energy. But I do hope that every time you load a truck, every time you make a restitution payment, every time you see a news article about tenant rights in California, you remember the faces of all the people you hurt. Jennifer Martinez and her kids, Margaret and Robert Chen living in their car, Daniel Torres and his service dog, every single person whose life you disrupted for profit. I hope you understand that what happened to you wasn't bad luck or an unfair system. It was consequences, pure and simple. You built an empire on exploitation, on taking advantage of people who couldn't fight back. And empires built on sand always fall eventually. You just had the misfortune of evicting someone who knew how to prove it, someone who had the skills and the anger and the stubbornness to see it through to the end. The housing crisis in California is still a disaster. Don't get me wrong. There are probably hundreds of landlords doing similar things to what Rick did, and most of them won't get caught because most tenants don't have the time, knowledge, or resources to fight back. But at least in Oakland, at least in the East Bay, landlords know now that there's precedent, that someone went down hard for this exact kind of fraud, that the city and the state are willing to pursue criminal charges, that one tenant with a spreadsheet and a former paralegal's knowledge can cost you everything. That's the legacy of this case. Not just Rick's downfall, but the warning to every other landlord who might be thinking about pulling the same scheme. The calculation has changed. The risk isn't worth it anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that means a few families will get to stay in their homes, a few kids won't have to change schools, a few elderly couples won't end up living in their cars. That would make all of this worth it. Every hour of research, every day in court, every sleepless night, every moment of stress and anxiety. If Rick's very public and very complete destruction prevents even one family from being fraudulently evicted, then it was worth it. Justice isn't just about punishment. Though watching Rick get sentenced to 6 years felt pretty good. Justice is about making things right. About creating a world where people like Rick can't exploit people like Jennifer Martinez with impunity. It's about changing the system so that the next tenant who gets an improper eviction notice has resources and precedent and a path to fight back. So if you're that next tenant, if you're reading this and you're facing something similar, remember, you have power. You have rights. The law is on your side if you know how to use it. Document everything. Learn your rights, find a lawyer, and fight back. You might be the thread that, when pulled, unravels an entire empire of exploitation. And even if you're not, even if your case doesn't result in criminal charges and foreclosures and justice on this scale, you still stood up for yourself. You still said no to being exploited. And that matters. Because the alternative, accepting it, rolling over, letting people like Rick get away with it, that's how the exploitation continues. That's how they win. Every tenant who fights back, who files a complaint, who calls a lawyer, who refuses to be victimized, makes it a little bit harder for the next Rick Carmichael to build his empire on other people's suffering. And that's the real point of all of this. Not revenge, though I won't lie and say the revenge didn't feel good. Not even justice in the abstract sense, though that was important too. The real point was making sure that Jennifer Martinez's kids could go back to their school, that Margaret and Robert Chen didn't have to live in their car, that Daniel Torres kept his service dog, that future tenants would have protection and precedent. Rick saw his tenants as resources to be extracted, as obstacles to higher profits, as problems to be eliminated. And in seeing them that way, in reducing human beings to spreadsheet cells and profit margins, he lost his own humanity. The tragedy, if there is one, is that he could have still made plenty of money being a decent landlord. He could have raised rents gradually in line with market increases, maintained his properties well, treated his tenants fairly, and still turned a good profit. But decent wasn't enough. He wanted more, always more, and that greed destroyed him. So here we are, almost 7 years after that piece of paper got slipped under my door. Rick is loading trucks in Modesto. I own a condo in Oakland. Sandra Chen runs an affordable housing cooperative. Jennifer Martinez and her kids are back in the East Bay. The legal system, slow and imperfect as it is, delivered something resembling justice. And maybe, just maybe, the next landlord who thinks about pulling a fraudulent owner move in eviction will remember what happened to Rick Carmichael and decide it's not worth the risk. That's the legacy. That's what makes this whole thing matter. Not my settlement, not Rick's sentence, but the change in the system, the precedent, the warning to bad actors that you can't exploit vulnerable people without consequences. Sometimes, once in a while, the system works. And when it does, it's worth fighting for.